Are we recording? I think so. Okay, I think we're recording. We are going to look at chapters 28 and 31. They're kind of oddly spaced. And we're going to look at protists and fungi, two of my favorite organisms. Groups of organisms, I guess I shall say. Okay, so when we get into class, remind me that we need to watch this very dramatic movie of protists. All right, so Mr. Anderson has some protists. I'll post about that. So just want to remind you that protists are the first or the simplest of the eukaryotes, right? So remember, we have domain bacteria, domain archaea, and now we're getting into domain eukarya. And in particular, we are looking at these simple protists, right? And if you think about how they differ from archaea and bacteria, just think of all the differences between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells, right? So protists represent really a grab bag of eukaryotic cells. They're mostly unicellular, but some of them can be multicellular. We're going to talk about those. It really distinguishes any eukaryote that is not a plant, animal, or fungi, right? So in these eukaryotes, you have protists, fungi, plants, and animals, right? Those are the four main kingdoms within there. These guys live in mostly aquatic or moist environments, mostly aquatic, frankly, and they are categorized into the photosynthesizers or the non-photosynthesizers. So those that photosynthesize are called algae. And a big misconception is that people put algae into the plant category, and that is not accurate. Algae is actually a protist. So algae is a protist. Right? It's a eukaryotic cell that's not a plant, animal, or a fungi, but a protist. Let's skip over that. So protists play key roles in ecological communities. All right. So the photosynthetic protists, or the protista, are really important in aquatic communities. And it has to do with the food web. And you've probably talked about food webs back in like 7th grade biology. Right? Where the primary producers or the photosynthesizers really are harnessing that energy from the sun. They're turning that energy into chemical energy, and then other organisms eat that, right? So we have these primary consumers, secondary consumers, and eventually these tertiary or the kind of apex consumers, right? But again, everything is supported by these lower primary producers. And in this case, in aquatic environments, that is often the algae, right? There's 3 kinds of algae. We have green algae, brown algae, and red algae. When you go to the beach next time, I want you to keep your eyes open because you can usually see all 3 kinds kind of scattered along the beach, right? So protists form a wide range of mutualistic and parasitic relationships. So these are both, remember, symbiotic, mutualistic, meaning they're both beneficial. Parasitic, one benefits and the other is harmed, right? And I just want to give you a couple examples of that. So the first example is that we have a mutualistic relationship when we talk about corals, right? So here are corals, where the coral kind of provides carbon dioxide and shelter. And then the photosynthetic algae live on that coral, and they produce energy that the coral can live from. Another mutualistic relationship are termites. Inside of a termite gut, so here is a dissected out termite gut, and you smush it under a microscope, and you can actually see these crazy little protists that are living in them, and that helps digest the wood. And then the last example that we have here is, I think that this is malaria. Just a minute, I want to just double check for you. This is, sorry, don't hate. Nope, don't hate. Let me just double check. I don't want to get it wrong. Come on. Come on. Okay, yes, this is malaria, and it is caused by a parasite called Plasmodium. So when the mosquito bites you, you get infection from these protists called Plasmodium. And those guys are obviously harmful. So that is a parasitic relationship. So there's three main groups of protists. We have animal-like protists, which are called protozoans. And you may have heard this word before. These are the eaters. So they actually physically eat other things. And an example of that is an amoeba. So often you can see these amoeba kind of look at this as going to phagocytose or eat this little thing in the middle, right? Some of these are ciliates. So paramecium have all of these thousands of cilia on the outside. These are also eaters. So those are both protozoans. Plant-like protists are the algae. These are, again, photosynthetic. They have some sort of chlorophyll and chloroplasts. And these really represent, and we're going to talk about this more when we get to plants, these are the ancestors to land plants. All right. And here are two nice examples of photosynthetic protists. One is Volvox and one is Euglena. And those you can see under a microscope. Euglena has a whip-like, I think, flagella on its end. And Volvox are these kind of sphericals. And here are the macroscopic algae that we can see at places like the beach. And the last one are fungus-like protists, right? And these they absorb their nutrients from decaying matter. And their examples are things like slime molds. Here you can see kind of an aquatic mold that seems to be digesting a fish. What we're going to learn later on about fungi is that fungi almost always contain chitin. That's one of the distinguishing characteristics. However, the fungus-like protists do not have chitin, right? But they can have other things such as flagella. So remember, anytime we're talking about protists, we are talking about eukaryotic cells. And remember, eukaryotic cells came about through the endosymbiont theory, right? And the endosymbiont theory is how mitochondria and chloroplasts came about, right? A prokaryotic cell ingesting another prokaryotic cell. So we're talking about these complex cells, protists. They can be animal-like, plant-like, and fungus-like. A few of my favorites, one are diatoms. So many of you guys have probably used like facial products that have like an exfoliant. And if you look on the ingredients, you will often see something called diatomaceous earth. And what that is are crushed up protists. And the reason that they make a good exfoliant is that these phytoplankton or microalgae, meaning these are also photosynthetic, these guys, the cell wall is made of glass. It's made of silica glass. And so if they're crushed up very, very fine, they actually make a nice exfoliant. Another one of my favorite examples is called Dictyostelium. Remind me to play you this movie. This is a fungus-like protist, and it has this very cool behavior of aggregation. So they kind of aggregate to form these kind of like motile little worms that can then grow into these fruiting bodies, right? A couple other ones, Trypanosomes. This is a parasitic protozoan. So this is an animal-like protist. They are flagellated. You can see this long whip-like tail, and they cause African sleeping sickness, you may have heard of, from the tsetse fly. This is a good crossword word if any of you guys do crosswords. And then the last one is one that my labs one of the labs in graduate school started studying. Is called Acetabularia. This is a single-celled green algae, but they can get up to 10 centimeters in a single cell, right? So this is very kind of breaks all the rules of why cells need to be so small. It's got some very weird things. All right, so do you have to know all of my favorite ones? No, but we are going to kind of do a lab at some point where you have to know a certain number of the protists, which I will point out at that point. All right, then moving on to the kingdom fungi. So I want to be very clear that fungi are not plants. They are not plants. A lot of people say that they're plants, but they are not. Just like a lot of people say algae are plants, but they are not, right? So the fungi are multicellular eukaryotes, right? So many of the time when we have unicellular eukaryotes, those are often the protists, right? But now we're moving into multicellularity. So the cell walls are made of this chitin, right? And again, chitin is made of glucose monomers that are strung together. They can have, fungi can reproduce by either sexual or asexual reproduction. And what we will see is that they use spores, right? So spores are kind of their way of having kind of like, yeah, so instead of seeds, plants often have seeds, fungi have spores. And if you look at a mushroom and you see these like delicate kind of gills on the inside, the spores are hidden in them and they will drop them out, right? Most fungi that you see most of it is haploid, right? Meaning it's 1N, meaning it only has one copy of the entire genome, right? Most of this entire mushrooms, those are all haploid, right? Which is different than humans, obviously, because we're mostly diploid. All right, fungi have extracellular digestion and absorption. So they kind of spill out digestive enzymes into their environment, and then they absorb the nutrients off of that. So that makes them what they're called heterotrophic decomposers. Heterotrophic, they can do this to many different types of organisms, and they decompose things. And they are made of this cool thing called hyphae. And remind me, I always play this very inappropriate rap video all about getting hyphae that was big back in the maybe 90s, early 2000s. But it always makes me think hyphae. Okay, so if we look at fungi, the structure. So remember, it has a chitinous cell wall. They are made of hyphae. Hyphae are thin microscopic strands of cells that make up fungi, right? So here are two examples of hyphae, right? Two examples. One, it's really made of one big long cell. Here, there's made of many cells. And so if you look at a fungus and you kind of take a cross section, the whole thing is made of this hyphae. But there are different structures. We have the mycelium, which is usually underground. And that is a mass of interweaving. That's like the feeding web of the hyphae. That's how the fungi can eat and absorb. And then they have this top part, which is all above ground, called the fruiting body. And the fruiting body, the main part is it's for reproductive. It is for making spores. And remember, as I said before, the spores can kind of rain down from these gills in the fruiting body. So fungi life cycle can be sexual or asexual. I'm not going to get into too much of this, but I do want you to be able to follow these kind of life cycles. So you always want to look at the key first. You want to note what is haploid and what is diploid. All right. So if we look just at the haploid first, we have our mycelium, which is kind of the feeding part, right? It will then create the fruiting body. The fruiting body will make those spores. The spores will start growing and remaking that mycelium, right? In terms of what happens if you have a sexually reproducing, you can have this mycelium kind of fuse with another mycelium. So two mycelium from different organisms, different fungi can fuse, right? And it forms this very weird phase called the heterokaryotic stage. And that is the result of two haploid hyphae fusing together, right? So if we had, that's my little mushroom 1, and we have a mushroom 2, and we have some mycelium fusing together, then that is called that's heterokaryotic. 2 hyphae from different organisms fusing together, right? And if you have that, you can then create a zygote, right? The zygote can go through meiosis to make spores, and then you can begin again. So again, I'm not going to grill you on any of this, but you should be able to read these life cycles. So here's just another example of that. So if we look at the asexual phase, you can see again, the mycelium will make these spores. Those spores will grow and you'll remake a mycelium. In the sexual, these hyphae can fuse, 2 different ones can fuse together. They can go through meiosis to create spores, and that can grow into another mycelium. So what in the heck are spores? Why do I keep talking about spores? Where do they come from? So a spore, by definition, is a tiny 1-cell reproductive unit. So these are haploid. It's a reproductive unit capable of giving rise to a completely new individual. All right. So here's just an example, a cross-section of a spore. Many of you may have seen these little crazy, I don't even know what they're called, little smoke bomb mushrooms, where you step on them and they release this cloud of spores. So you literally have millions of spores coming out of here, each one capable of creating an entirely new organism. So if we look at spores, spores can be produced in 2 different kinds of cells. One, spores can be made in an asci, and 2, they can be made in a basidia. The ascis have a outer covering, right? Whereas the basidia, the spores just grow right on top and they're made externally, right? So asci within a covering, basidiae, they're produced extracellularly. All right, so 3 main groups of fungi. We have 1, the zygomycetes, which are the molds, right? And here's some super awesome examples of that. Here we have athlete's foot down there. We have the bread molds, and we have the mold that grows on our fruit. 2, ascomycetes. So remember, asco sounds like ASCII. So these spores are made in ASCII. These are yeast and the sac fungi. So here are some examples of some more morels and truffles. Here is baker's yeast, which is responsible for making bread, beer, wine, etc. And then the third group is called the basidiomycetes. And these are ones that the spores are made in the basidia. So these are external spores, whereas the asci are internal spores. All right. And these are the typical mushrooms that you see, the typical fungi that you see on trees. Okay, so fungi often live in symbiotic relationships, similar that we saw with the protists, right? And I just want to show you 2 examples that you absolutely have to know. Number 1, lichen. You have to know what a lichen is, right? Mostly because they're so awesome. This is a mutualistic relationship between a photosynthetic algae and a fungi. Right? So what are the benefits of each? So what does the cyanobacteria or the algae give off? They were going to collect sun, right? And they are going to give off sugar, right? So the fungi is getting food from there. What is the fungi doing to help the cyanobacteria? They give a protective area, right? So when you go out hiking and you see these kind of stuff that's on rocks, or you see this, which grows on trees, those are lichen. It's a symbiotic mutualistic relationship between photosynthetic algae, which is a protist, and a fungi. The second one that you absolutely have to know is called mycorrhizae, right? So mycorrhizae is a mutualistic relationship between fungi and plant roots, right? over 90% of all plants have some sort of fungus in their plant roots, and it helps with absorption of nutrients. And we'll come back to that as well. You can also have parasitic relationships, such as a fungus that have specialized hyphae that feed on other living organisms. And you can see this really disgusting toe where it's a parasitic relationship, and that fungi is actually invading and eating the flesh of a human toe. All right, a couple of my favorites. The largest organism in the world is often considered the honey mushroom. This is a parasitic fungi. It's long-lived. It is very, very old, and it has covered football fields. And I think this picture is in Oregon. Giant amounts of area covered by this mushroom. And remember, the hyphae is connecting all of it. So it's going to be considered kind of one major organism. Lion's mane mushroom is another one you may have heard of. It's in the wellness world right now. It is edible, and people have shown that it has some medicinal qualities. The extracts can potentially inhibit cancer cell metastasis. All right, and that's it. We will stop there. Peace.